My stepfather tied my horse to the fence post and lit the hay bales while I watched from the barn loft, and he made sure I smelled every scream. I was 13 years old. Ember was 4, a chestnut mare I'd broken myself, the only creature on that ranch who met my eyes without looking away first, without calculating what my body could be used for. She'd carried me through fields where the wheat grew taller than my head, through creeks where the water ran cold and clean, through nights when my stepfather's boots on the stairs meant I needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else fast. That evening, I'd found my stepfather in the tack room. He was burning my mother's things, her wedding dress, the quilt her mother had made, the letters from her sister in Tulsa she'd never been allowed to visit. The dress was already ash, but the quilt was smoldering, the cotton batting blackening at the edges, and I could see my grandmother's hand-stitched roses curling like dead spiders. "Your mother was proud," he said, not looking up from the flames. "Proud women need to learn what fire does to pride." My mother had been dead 6 months. Riding accident, the sheriff had written, though her horse had come back without a scratch and she'd had bruises on her arms that looked like fingerprints. My stepfather had collected the insurance, paid off the ranch's debts, and started looking at me the way he'd once looked at her, like something that could be trained, broken, made useful. I didn't say anything. I'd learned not to say anything when he talked about my mother. Agreement made him nostalgic. Silence made him instructional. There was no right answer, only varying degrees of wrong that ended with his belt or his rope or the flat of his hand against the side of my head. I went to the barn. I found Ember in her stall, nickering at my footsteps, pressing her warm nose into my palm. I saddled her. I rode her out past the north fence, past the property line, past the place where the wheat gave way to wild grass and the stars weren't blocked by the ranch house's security lights. We galloped. I let her run until her coat was dark with sweat, until my thighs burned, until the wind erased the smell of smoke from my hair. Then I walked her back, slow, whispering that we would leave soon, that I was saving money from the rodeo purses I'd hidden in a coffee can, that we would find a place where fire was only for warmth and hay was only for eating and fences were only for keeping cattle in. My stepfather found us. He always found us. He was standing in the barn doorway with a bottle in one hand and a coil of rope in the other, the same rope he'd used on my mother's horse, the one that had spooked and thrown her. "Get down," he said. I didn't move. "Sage," he said, using my name like a command to a dog. "Get down." I slid off Ember's back. I stood between her and him. She was 16 hands of muscle and trust, but she was still an animal, still vulnerable to the things humans did with rope and fire and the certainty that might made right. "You rode my horse without permission," he said. "You took what's mine into the dark. You think you're special. You think this animal loves you." He laughed. "Animals don't love. They obey. And obedience is earned through consequences." He didn't touch me. That was the worst part. He didn't need to. He walked past me, past Ember, to the hay storage. He dragged out 3 bales, the good alfalfa, the winter feed enough to last a month. He placed them in a line in front of the fence post. He tied Ember's lead rope to the post, tight so she couldn't step back, so she couldn't run. Then he took out his lighter. "No," I said. It was the only word I had, the only word left. He looked at me. He smiled. "This is what happens," he said, "when you put an animal before your family. When you think you can take what's mine and make it yours." He flicked the lighter. The flame was small, orange, almost gentle. Ember's a disobedient mare. Disobedient animals burn. He touched the flame to the hay. It caught fast. Alfalfa is dry, the barn is warm, the air is still. The bales went up in seconds, a wall of heat and light between me and my horse. Ember screamed. Not a whinny, a scream. A sound I'd never heard from a horse. A sound that came from somewhere deeper than fear, somewhere animal and ancient and pure. I ran at the fire. He caught me. His arm around my waist, lifting me off the ground, holding me so I could see, so I could smell, so I could hear every second of my horse's mane catching, of her coat blackening, of her eyes rolling white and wild above the flames. "Watch," he said in my ear. His breath smelled of whiskey and chewing tobacco. "Watch what pride costs." I watched. I screamed. I clawed at his arm until I drew blood, but he was bigger, he was stronger, he was sober enough to hold me and drunk enough to enjoy it. Ember reared, fighting the rope, the nylon melting into her flesh, the post charring, her hooves striking sparks from the dirt. She screamed until her throat gave out, until the sound was just air whistling through damaged tissue, until she collapsed against the post and the fire consumed what was left. It took 7 minutes. I counted. I still count sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. At 4 minutes her struggles weakened. At 5 she stopped rearing. At 6, she was on her knees, her head low, her breath coming in ragged pulls that drew smoke into lungs that had never known anything but clean air. At 7, she was still. My stepfather let me go. I fell to the ground. The hay had burned to ash, but the post was still smoldering, and Ember's body was blackened, unrecognizable, her beautiful chestnut coat gone, her mane gone, the white star on her forehead that I'd kissed every morning since she was a foal gone. "Clean this up," my stepfather said. He walked back to the house. I heard the television turn on westerns, his favorite, the ones where men were men and horses were tools and women knew their place. I sat in the dirt. I held what was left of Ember's halter. The nylon melted into a shape that no longer fit anything living. She was still warm. I kept thinking, I knew she was dead, but I kept thinking that if I held her long enough, if I pressed my ear to her chest, if I whispered her name enough times, she would breathe again, she would rise, she would carry me away from this place and this man and this life where love ended in fire. She didn't. I buried her at dawn. My stepfather was asleep, snoring in the recliner, the empty bottle on the floor beside his boots. I took a shovel from the equipment shed, the same shovel I'd used to muck stalls, to spread gravel, to dig post holes. I dug a grave in the north pasture, in the spot where Ember had liked to roll, where the grass was sweetest and the view went on forever. The ground was hard from summer drought. It took 3 hours. My hands blistered, then bled. I didn't cry. I'd learned not to cry where he could hear, but I cried while I dug, silently, tears falling into the hole, sizzling on the still warm earth. I placed Ember in the grave. I covered her with soil. I placed a flat stone on top, a piece of granite from the creek bed, and I scratched her name into it with a nail from the barn. Ember. And below that, because I was 13 and dramatic and heartbroken, she carried me farther than my feet could go. Then I made a promise. Not out loud, just in the part of myself that my stepfather hadn't burned yet, the part that still believed in things like justice and rescue, and the possibility of a world where love didn't end in smoke. "I will come back for you," I promised Ember's ghost. "I will come back, and I will bring the horses she couldn't burn. And he will never ride again." Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're here, maybe you know what it means to have your love lit on fire while you're held close enough to feel the heat. Maybe you know the particular horror of smelling something you love turn to ash while a man's arm holds you in place. Maybe you know what it's like to dig a grave with bleeding hands in dirt still warm from the fire, swearing to the stone that you will not forget. If that's you, subscribe. Not because I have comfort, because I have a shovel. And because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me standing in my stepfather's barn, watching him beg for a horse that won't come, while the mare he sold to a slaughterhouse stood at my shoulder and waited for a command I never gave. Here's my story. I left at 17. Not ran, left. I filed for emancipation with a lawyer from a legal aid clinic, a social worker who'd seen the burn scars on my arms from when I'd tried to reach Ember, a judge who looked at my stepfather's DUI record and my documented injuries, and signed the papers while my stepfather sat in the gallery, too drunk to object, too proud to beg. I became a horse trainer. Not the rodeo kind, though I had the skills, though I'd won purses on Ember's back, though I could ride anything with 4 legs and a temper. I became an equine therapist. I worked with trauma horses, animals who'd been abused, burned, starved, used in rodeo roughstock until their bodies broke, shipped to slaughterhouses until rescue intervened. Horses who flinched at raised voices, who wouldn't load into trailers, who stood in corners of stalls with their heads low and their eyes empty, waiting for the next thing that would hurt them. I was good at it, better than good. I understood horses in a way I never understood people. Horses were honest. Their fear was real, their trust was real, their partnership had to be earned every day. You couldn't force a horse to carry you, not really. Not the kind of carrying that held through thunder and strangers and the smell of smoke. You had to build safety. You had to become a place where the world couldn't reach them. I worked in sanctuaries, in rehabilitation centers, in a program for veterans with PTSD where the horses had their own trauma, where the healing went both ways, where a scarred mare and a broken soldier could learn to trust each other enough to walk through fire, literal fire, in some cases, desensitization training with smoke machines and controlled flames, teaching horses that not every heat meant death. I came home at 34 with a degree in equine-assisted therapy, a burned scar on my forearm from a rescue that had gone wrong, and a file full of success stories I didn't care about. My stepfather was still alive, still on the ranch, still drinking, though now it was vodka instead of whiskey, and the westerns had been replaced by Fox News, the irony of which I would appreciate later. He didn't call me. I didn't call him, but I watched. I hired a private investigator, a retired sheriff's deputy who specialized in rural property disputes, who took my money and my story and sent me monthly reports. My stepfather was failing. The ranch was in foreclosure. His liver was circling the drain. He'd had 2 DUIs, a suspended license, and a reputation in the county as a man who'd had bad luck with women, the euphemism that followed him like a shadow. That kept neighbors polite but distant. That meant no one helped when the fences fell or the well ran dry. Then the investigator sent me something else. A lead. A livestock auction record, the same auction house where I'd once watched my mother sell her prize heifers to pay my stepfather's debts, had a purchase from my stepfather's account. 1 year earlier. 1 gray gelding for personal use, sold to a buyer whose address matched a known kill buyer, the middleman who purchased horses by the pound and shipped them to Mexican slaughterhouses. He'd done it again. Not to my horse, Ember was long ash, but to some other horse, some other trust, some other creature who'd thought it was safe because it was his. I drove to the ranch. I didn't call first. I didn't announce myself. I just parked in the driveway, the same driveway where Ember had once trotted to meet me, where I'd hidden my rodeo purses in a coffee can, where my life had ended and begun in fire, and I knocked on the door that had once locked me out of the barn. My stepfather opened it. He was smaller than I remembered. Not just physically, though he was gaunt, his skin yellowed, his hands shaking, but in presence. In threat. In the ability to make me afraid. But I was still afraid. I felt it the moment I crossed the threshold. The barn where he'd burned Ember. The north pasture where I'd dug. The tack room where he'd burned my mother's things. The house where his boots had sounded on the stairs, where I'd learned to sleep with one eye open and a knife under my pillow. Sage, my stepfather said. His voice was the same. Gravel and authority. The voice of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. My little cowgirl, you've come home. Yes, I said, I have, I moved in. I told him I was between jobs, that I needed a place to stay, that I'd heard he was sick, that I wanted to help, that I forgave him, the lie I knew he wanted to hear, the one he'd been waiting for since the night he burned my horse. He believed me, of course he believed me. Narcissists always believe forgiveness is their due. They think cruelty is currency, and if they spend enough of it, eventually someone will pay them back with obedience. I explored the ranch while he slept. His room, unchanged, the same quilt. The same photos of himself younger and straighter and more dangerous. The same pistol in the nightstand drawer. The barn, where the hay storage had been rebuilt, where the fence post had been replaced, where the dirt was still darker than the surrounding soil, still rich with what had been my horse. The north pasture, where the granite stone was still there, though the name had worn away to nothing. And the back 40. Fenced off, posted with no trespassing signs, the grass too tall for cattle. The gate padlocked, I climbed the fence. I walked the property. There were bones. Horse bones, scattered, weathered, some with halter hardware still attached. 5, 6, 7 skeletons in varying states of decay in a line that stretched toward the property line. And at the end, fresh, within months, a pit covered with a sheet of plywood, the dirt around it still disturbed, the smell still present if you knew what to look for. He'd been doing it for years. Not just Ember, not just the gray gelding from the auction. Horses he'd bought cheap, horses he'd trained, horses he'd broken and used and discarded when they stopped being useful. A graveyard in the back 40, marked with nothing but his indifference. But there was one horse that was different. I heard her before I saw her, a whinny, soft and questioning, coming from the equipment shed near the house. I found her in a stall built from scrap lumber, too small, with a water trough that was green with algae and a hay net that was almost empty. A gray mare. Young, maybe 3, with a white blaze that ran from her poll to her nostrils and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was thin, not starved, but underfed, her ribs showing, her coat dull. But her eyes were alert. Aware. Alive in a way that nothing else on this ranch was alive. She nickered when she saw me. Not a demand, a question. Are you the one who hurts, or the one who helps? I didn't take her, not yet. I needed to be careful. I needed a plan. I needed to do what I'd promised Ember I would do, not just rescue, but make my stepfather understand. Make him feel what I'd felt. Make him stand in the dark and smell smoke and know that the thing he loved was burning and he couldn't stop it. I named her Ash, because she'd risen from what he'd tried to destroy. Because she was gray as smoke, as ash, as the remains of everything he'd burned. Because she was the shape of what came after fire, new growth, stubborn life, the green that pushes through blackened earth. I didn't keep Ash on the ranch. That would have been too obvious, too risky. I boarded her at a stable 20 miles away, paid cash, used a fake name, told the owner I was a traveling therapist. I visited her every night after my stepfather passed out. After the house was dark and the only sound was his snoring and the distant coyotes, I rebuilt her, not into a weapon, into a witness. I taught her that my hand meant safety, that my voice meant direction, that my presence meant the world was not going to hurt her. I taught her to come when I called, a specific whistle, 3 notes, the same whistle I'd used for Ember. I taught her to stand, to wait, to hold her ground without fleeing when things got scary. And I taught her my stepfather's scent. I collected it carefully, a shirt from the laundry, a boot from the closet. The saddle he'd used on the gray gelding, still hanging in the tack room, still smelling of his sweat and his cruelty. I let Ash smell them, rewarded her when she found them hidden, when she tracked them across the arena, when she stood and watched without spooking. My stepfather didn't know about Ash. He thought I'd found a job. Finally, he said, some responsibility, and was spending my evenings at a clinic in town. He didn't know I was training a gray mare with a storm-cloud gaze to do what Ember never could: survive him, outlast him, and make him afraid of the dark. I moved back onto the ranch full-time. I played the devoted daughter, cooking his meals, managing his medications, listening to his stories, smiling at his jokes. And every night I planted the seeds of his undoing. It started small. A horseshoe on his pillow, not real, a decorative one I'd bought at a feed store, but heavy enough to feel threatening in the dark. He woke shouting. "The horses," he muttered. "The horses are back." "Dreams," I said, bringing him water. "Just dreams," then sounds. Whinnying, soft and distant, coming from the back 40. I'd recorded Ash, her nicker, her blow, her warning snort, and I played it through a Bluetooth speaker I'd hidden in the hay storage. My stepfather searched the barn with a flashlight, checked the pastures, checked the equipment shed, found nothing. He started drinking earlier, sleeping less. Then the smoke. I rigged the wood stove in the living room to backdraft, just enough to fill the room with the smell of wood smoke, irregular, unpredictable. The smell of a barn burning, of hay catching, of horsehair singeing. He stopped using the stove. He bought electric heaters rather than risk building a fire. He started seeing horses. Not Ash, I kept her away, but shapes that moved at the edge of his vision, silhouettes that disappeared when he turned his head, pairs of eyes that reflected the porch light. I used reflective tape, cut into ovals, placed at strategic heights on fence posts. I used a laser pointer through the window, brief flashes of red that vanished before he could focus. "It's Ember," my stepfather muttered one night, drunk, staring at the back 40. "She's back." The little bitch sent her back. "Who's back?" I asked, innocent. "Ember, the mare, the one who," he stopped, looked at me. His eyes were wet, yellowed, the eyes of a dying man seeing ghosts. "You don't remember, you were too young." "I remember everything," I said. He didn't hear me. He was looking past me into the dark, where nothing was there but the tape and the speakers and the faint smell of smoke that lingered in his clothes. The nightmare started. My stepfather woke shouting, screaming names, not from his life, but from the back 40. Names he'd never spoken aloud, names from auction records and kill buyer receipts, names of horses he'd broken and burned and buried. He'd wake drenched in sweat, reach for his pistol, find me standing in the doorway with a glass of water. "Bad dream?" I'd ask. "Go to bed," he'd snap, but his hand shook, and he never went back to sleep. I replaced his sleeping pills with placebos. I encouraged his drinking, brought home bottles, poured his drinks, watched him sink deeper into the fog where the ghosts lived. I wanted him awake enough to see, drunk enough to doubt, tired enough to break. It took 8 months. 8 months of training with Ash, of planting evidence, of feeding paranoia, of being the perfect daughter while I dismantled my stepfather's mind piece by piece. And then, the night before the anniversary of Ember's death, August 14th, I found the confession. It wasn't planned. My stepfather, in a drunken stupor, had fallen in the barn. He'd hit his head on a post, not hard enough to injure but hard enough to disorient. I helped him to bed. I sat with him while he drifted, muttering into the space between sleep and waking. And then he started talking. Not to me, to them, to the horses, to my mother, to the ghosts he'd spent his life creating. "Ember," he whispered, "I'm sorry, I had to, she was turning on me. The mare was turning her." I pulled out my phone. I started recording. "And Margaret," he continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to, the rope, I just wanted her to stop talking, to stop planning. She was going to leave me, she was going to take the girl. The diaries, Margaret, why did you write them? Why did you have to remember?" He sobbed, a sound I'd never heard from him. Wet, broken, childish. "The horses," he said, "the ones in the back 40. I burned them, all of them, to teach her. To teach her that pride is weakness, that nothing she loves is safe. That I am the only thing that matters. He opened his eyes. He looked at me, but he didn't see me. He saw my mother. He saw Ember. He saw the accumulation of every cruelty he'd ever committed, standing in the doorway with a phone in its hand. "I'm sorry," he said, to me, to them, to the air. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I didn't accept his apology. I didn't speak. I just recorded and waited, and watched him sink back into sleep with tears on his face that were too late, too small, too meaningless. I had what I needed: the confession, the names, the proof, but I didn't call the police, not yet. The next night, August 14th, the anniversary, I made dinner. Steak, his favorite, potatoes, whiskey. I let him drink, encouraged him, poured his glass full every time it emptied. I wore jeans the color of ash. I smiled. I listened to his stories, his memories, justifications. After dinner, he went to the porch for a cigarette. I followed. The night was warm still, the stars hidden by smoke from distant wildfires common in August, unremarkable but enough to tint the air orange and make everything feel like the world was burning. He lit his cigarette. He looked at the north pasture, and he froze. Ash was there, not hidden, not distant. 20 feet away, standing at the fence line, visible in the porch light. Her gray coat, her white blaze, her storm-cloud eyes. Watching. My stepfather dropped the cigarette. "Ember," he whispered, "no, no, you're dead, I burned you." He turned to run, stumbled, fell against the railing. I didn't move, I just watched. Ash didn't move either, she stood, she waited. She was trained to do that, to hold, to watch, to be present without fleeing until the command came. But I didn't give the command, I never would. My stepfather scrambled to his feet. He ran inside. He grabbed his pistol from the nightstand. He came back to the porch, waving it, screaming at the dark, at Ash, at the ghosts that weren't there. "Come on," he shouted. "Come on, you devil, you want me? Come get me." Ash didn't move, she just stood and watched and waited. My stepfather fired. The shot went wild into the pasture. He fired again, and again. Emptying the magazine at a horse that was no longer there, Ash had vanished at the first shot, melted into the dark. Her training holding, the neighbors called the sheriff. I called them too from the kitchen, my voice trembling, the perfect frightened daughter. "My stepfather," I said, "he's having an episode. He's armed, please hurry." They came with sirens. They found my stepfather on the porch, pistol in hand, screaming at the pasture, urine running down his leg, his face purple, his eyes wild. They disarmed him. They cuffed him. They read him his rights while he babbled about horses, about ghosts, about confessions he'd made to a daughter who didn't exist. I gave them my phone. The recording, the diaries I'd found in his closet, my mother's letters, her own handwritten admissions, the auction house receipts. The location of the graves in the back 40, marked with nothing but his indifference. The name of the kill buyer, who confirmed the purchases. The death certificate of my mother, the sheriff's report I'd requested, the rope burns on her wrists that had never been investigated. My stepfather was arrested. Not for burning Ember, the statute of limitations on animal cruelty had passed. Not for my mother's death, riding accident, the original sheriff had ruled, and proving otherwise would take years. But for the confessed fraud, the illegal disposal of animal remains, the unregistered weapon, the threats to neighbors. Enough to hold him. Enough to start. He was evaluated by a court psychiatrist. Diagnosed with alcohol-induced dementia, paranoid psychosis, antisocial personality disorder. Sent to a psychiatric facility rather than prison. I didn't attend the hearing. I didn't need to see him in restraints, in a hospital gown, in the kind of locked room he'd built for me with his fear. But I visited once. 3 months after his commitment. He was smaller than I'd ever seen him. The boots were gone. The belt was gone. He was just an old man in a wheelchair, oxygen tube in his nose, staring at a wall. I sat across from him. I didn't speak. I just opened my hand, and Ash, who I'd brought, who was allowed as my therapy animal, who stood at my side like smoke-made flesh, pressed her nose into my palm. My stepfather saw her. His eyes widened, his mouth opened. No sound came out. "This is Ash," I said. "You were going to sell her to a slaughterhouse. She lived, she learned, she chose to stay with me." I stood up. I walked to the door. Ash followed, her gait steady, her gray coat silver in the fluorescent light, her white blaze bright as a fresh burn. "She doesn't need to attack you," I said, my hand on the doorframe. "She just needs to exist, to be here, to be alive when you're not." I left. I didn't look back. I heard my stepfather screaming as the orderlies restrained him, screaming about horses, about fire, about the daughter who'd brought the past into his present and made it stand and wait and watch. I didn't keep the ranch. I sold it to a land trust who restored the prairie, removed the fences, planted native grasses where the back 40 had been. I didn't visit the grave markers. I had the remains exhumed, All 7 horses cremated, the ashes scattered in a meadow where I'd ridden with Ash, where grass grew thick and no one had ever burned. I bought land. 200 acres, remote, with a barn and an arena and pastures that went on forever. I called it Ember's Run. Not a ranch. A sanctuary. For horses rescued from slaughter pipelines, from abusive trainers, from rodeo rough stock, from the kind of fire that makes a creature forget that not every human brings smoke. We didn't train submission. We trained partnership. We didn't break spirits, we healed witnesses. The logo was a horse silhouette with a flame inside. The motto, we don't break horses, we build trust. Ash was the first resident. She became the teacher, the mare who showed newcomers that humans could be different, that hands could mean gentleness, that fire was for warmth and hay was for eating and fences were only for keeping danger out. She lived 12 more years. When she died, I buried her in the meadow, in ground that was soft, in a grave that was deep, with my hands that didn't bleed because no one had made me dig in the dark. I still ride at dawn. Every morning, through the pastures, through the meadow, through the place where Ash is buried. And every time a new horse, scarred, frightened, expecting the worst, meets my eyes without looking away, who carries me through fields where the grass is taller than my head, who trusts me enough to walk through the smoke of a desensitization session without bolting, I smile. Because the mare my stepfather was going to sell to teach humility learned something better. She learned that partnership is not demanded. It is offered. That trust is not burned into submission. It is built day by day, choice by choice, until the creature that was broken becomes the creature that heals others. And my stepfather in his hospital room still screams at shadows, still sees horses in the corners, still waits for a fire that will never come because the worst thing I could do to him was not violence. It was patience. It was presence. It was the simple, terrible fact of a horse who lived when he wanted her dead, who chose to stay when he wanted her gone, who stands in my memory forever, watching, waiting, and never fleeing. I'm Sage. I'm 35 years old. I'm a daughter who buried her horse with bleeding hands in dirt still warm from fire, who grew up to be the human Ember believed she could be, who learned that the opposite of cruelty is not kindness. It is consistency. It is showing up every day until the broken thing learns to trust again. If someone ever burned what you loved to teach you humility, or if they made you dig your own heart up in ground that was too hot to touch, drop a fire below. I read every single comment. And if this story made you want to whistle for what carries you, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. What are you finally ready to dig up? Backhand index pointing down.